Welcome. Today we're going to be taking a look at Twilight Imperium 4th Edition. This is a 3 to 6 player area control Civilization 4X game where you take the role of one of the 17 factions going for galactic domination through bartering, plotting, and waging war upon the other players, trying to complete objectives. You are trying to claim the Imperial throne and become the most dominant faction. Now, how do you become the most dominant faction? By being the first player to 10 victory points. Now that we know what the winning condition is, let's take a look at the components, setup, and how a round and phase work in Twilight Imperium 4th Edition. Now let's take a look at the components for Twilight Imperium 4th Edition. We're going to start with the system tiles, which are the hexagons you see in the middle of the table. Next is the victory point track that you see above the system tiles. Then we have cards. You have the strategy cards, which are 1 through 8. You have your planet cards. You have your objective cards, which are either 1, 2, or secret. You have your action cards. You have your agenda cards. You have your technology cards, which can either be in the color or in your faction. Unit upgrade cards. And finally, promissory note cards, which also have normal promissory notes and then faction-specific promissory notes. For tokens, you have the speaker token, the alpha and beta tokens, the zero token, custodian token, assimilator tokens, trade good or commodity, infantry tokens, and finally fighter tokens. Next you have your faction sheet, and then the matching symbol that you see in the top right corner, you're going to get the command tokens that match and the control tokens that match that symbol. Now the color specific components, you have your command sheet, so this would be for the purple player. And then in that color, you're going to take all of the plastic units. The units are the following: War Sun, Flagship, Dreadnought, Cruiser, Carrier, Destroyer, Fighter, Infantry, PDS, Space Dock. And finally, we have dice. Now let's look at the setup for Twilight Imperium 4th Edition. We're going to be setting this up for a 3-player game, which takes 12 steps. Step number 1 is determine the speaker. So you're going to be choosing at random the first player. In this case, we chose yellow. Step number 2 is to assign factions. If this is your first time playing the game, then they have a list of 6 factions in the rulebook that which the speaker could then pass out at random to each player. And if you played the game before, you can choose your own faction. Step number 3 is to gather faction-specific components. So each player will take their home system tile, their control and command tokens for their faction, and 2 technology cards for their faction. Step number 4 is to choose a color. You'll get the command sheet, and then you'll get your units matching that color, and then you'll also get your technology cards matching that color. Step number 5 is to get starting planet cards. These are going to be based on the planets in your home system. Step number 6 is to create the main game board. If it's your first time playing, there is a diagram in the rulebook based on the number of players how to set up the main game board. So as you see, this is the first game setup for a 3-player game. Step number 7 is to place the custodian token in the center of your game board. Step number 8 is to shuffle your common decks, which are your action deck, your agenda deck, and your 3 objective decks. Step number 9 is to create a supply. So you're going to pile the trade good tokens, the infantry tokens, and the fighter tokens around the main game board. Step number 10, you are going to place your strategy cards near the speaker Step number 11 is to gather your starting components. You're going to find your technology and your starting units on the back side of your faction sheet in the bottom left corner. So this faction will start with these 2 technologies and 6 different types of starting units. Now, if your home system has multiple planets, it is recommended that you put your infantry and your space dock on the planet that has the highest resource value or yellow number that you see. You are also going to be putting 3 of your command tokens in the tactics section of your command sheet, and then you're going to be placing 3 of your command tokens in the unit side on the fleet section of your command sheet, and then you're going to be placing 2 command tokens in the strategy. And finally, step number 12, we are going to prepare objectives. So each player is going to draw 1 secret objective and keep it hidden from the other players. Then place 1 of the control tokens on the 0 on the victory point track. Then the speaker will draw 5 stage 1 objectives and place them above the victory point track. Draw 5 stage 2 objectives below the victory point track, and then reveal the first 2 stage 1 objectives. Now let's take a look at how a round and phase work in Twilight Imperium 4th edition. Each round consists of 4 phases. Phase 1 is your strategy phase, where you choose strategy cards or card. Phase 2 is the action phase, where players take turns taking an action. Phase 3 is the status phase, where you perform cleanup steps. And then finally, phase 4 is the agenda phase, where players vote on political agendas only after a player controls the center of the board. Now let's take a look at these phases in depth, starting with phase 1, the strategy phase. It is during this phase that players take turns, starting with the speaker, taking a strategy card that they could use later in the round during the action phase, and the number on that particular card determines the action phase order. If this is a 3 or 4 player game, you're going to have 2 rounds of strategy card selection, and the lowest of the 2 would determine your action phase order. When considering which strategy card to select during this phase, you want to understand that the primary abilities will be the action you take during your action phase, while the secondary ability is the actions the other players get to take during your turn on the action phase. The remaining strategy cards that are not chosen will receive 1 trade good to make them more enticing during the next round. Phase 2 is the action phase. In initiative order, players are going to take actions 1 at a time until all have passed. The type of actions that you can take during this phase are tactical, strategic, and component. A player cannot pass unless they've used their strategy card. Now let's take a look at the types of actions that you can take during this phase, starting with the tactical action. This action has 5 possible steps that allow you to interact with the game board. Step 1 is the activation. You must place a command token from your tactical section on your command sheet into the system you want to activate. You cannot activate a system twice. Step 2 is the movement. You may move units into the system that you are activating. The ships must end their movement in the active system. Ships cannot move to the active system through a system that contains another player's ships. Also, players can't move ships in a system that has a command token. Also, some of your ships have capacity. This will allow you to carry fighters or infantry units from one system to the other. There are wormholes on the board that you see alpha and beta. Those are considered to be adjacent to the corresponding alpha and beta on the other side of the board. You also see red tiles on the main game board. If you see an asteroid field or a supernova, you can't move through or into that particular tile. If you see a nebula, you can move in but not through. If you end up defending while in the nebula, you get +1 to your die roll. And then while moving out of the nebula, you get a move of 1. Another type of anomaly for a tile is the gravity rift. You get +1 movement, and if you move out of it, you have to roll a die. If you roll a 1 to 3, then your ship is destroyed. After we have moved into the system that is activated, you check for the space cannon ability for any of the other players if they have one in that system. Step 3 is the space combat. If multiple players have ships in an active system, then you're going to follow the following steps. Step 1 is the Anti-Barrage ability check. Step 2 is announce retreat. You have to announce the retreat now so that after one round of combat, you may move your ships to another space. If you have infantry in a particular planet and you announce your retreat, you would move them off the planet and into space. Step 3 is to make combat rolls. Each player will roll 1 die for each ship in the active system. If you are greater than or equal to the combat number for that ship, it hit. If it has 2 marks next to the combat, then you would roll 2 die for that particular unit. Step 4 is to assign damage. So for each hit that you had, the other player will take one of their ships out. Step 5 is to retreat. If this was announced during the second step of the space combat, a player can retreat. Combat will then continue until only one player is left in the system. The fourth step of the tactical action is the invasion, where you invade planets in a particular system. When doing so, you first do a bombardment check to see if another player's bombardment ability can be used. Second, you commit the number of ground forces by placing them on the planet. Third, you do a space cannon defense check. So if another player has that ability, it would take place now. Fourth, the ground combat would take place. So just like the space combat, you would roll and then assign hits. And then finally, you establish control. Whoever has control over the planet at the end of the invasion would get the planet card and then destroy any of the opposing player's structures. And finally, step 5 of the tactical action is the production, where you produce units using the space dock. The number of units is based on the space dock production. Once you've figured out how many units you can produce using your space dock production based on the faction board and the location of your space dock, then you can pay the cost for the units that you are producing by exhausting planets, exhausting the planet card and flipping it over, or paying trade goods, which can be used as resources or influence. The second type of action is the strategic action. You are going to perform any primary ability on the strategy card. Then, after you've performed the primary ability, all of the other players have the option to pay and perform the secondary ability. The third type of action is the component act. These are actions listed on an action card, faction sheet, or tech cards. You always see the word action next to this ability. And then lastly, let's look at the command sheet. You're going to utilize your tactic command tokens for tactic actions on the board. You're going to use your fleet command tokens to determine the max ships in any one system. And then the strategy. These are going to be utilized when you are activating a secondary ability on a strategy card. That brings us to phase 3, the status phase. You are going to perform 8 cleanup steps during the status phase. Step 1 is to score objectives. In initiative order, you're going to score at most 1 public and 1 secret objective. Step 2 is to reveal the next objective. Once you've revealed all level 1s, you move on to level 2. Step 3 is to draw action cards. Each player draws 1 action card. Step 4 is to remove the command tokens from the board to your supply. Step 5 is to gain 2 command tokens, and then you are able to redistribute your command tokens on your command sheet. Step 6 is to ready cards. You're going to ready all of your exhausted cards from the round. Step 7 is to repair units. If you had a unit that was damaged during the combat, you can flip that particular unit back upright. And then finally, step 8 is to return your strategy cards. After you perform these actions, you're going to check to see if we go to the agenda phase or if we start a new round. If the custodian token is still in the center, then we will go to the next round. If somebody has taken that particular token, then we go to the agenda phase. Phase 4 is the agenda phase, where we vote on political agendas. A player must land on the planet in the center of the game board and take that token by paying 6 influence immediately. Once they've done that, they'll gain 1 victory point, and we will have phase 4 for the rest of the game. During phase 4, you can perform 3 steps. Step 1 is to reveal the first agenda. The speaker will draw and read aloud the agenda. Players will then vote on the agenda by exhausting planets that they have for their influence. They will cast the number of votes based on the influence for the planets that they are going to be exhausting. Players can negotiate during the vote, and then they will announce the player or the planet that the votes are going for. Once All of the players have cast votes. The outcome will be resolved, and if it is a tie, then it is settled by the speaker. Step number 2 is to repeat this process for a second agenda, and then step 3 is to then ready your planets for the next round. Now let's take a look at some of the additional rules that we haven't had a chance to go through. When you have no units on a particular planet, but you control the planet, you will mark it with a control token. On your faction board, for unit symbols, if you see an arrow, then that means that that unit has an upgrade. If you see 2 marks next to like infantry or your fighters, that means you will get 2 units when you pay that cost. Whenever you use a strategy action, you're going to take that strategy card and flip it over once you've used it. When you've scored objectives, you are going to put one of your control tokens on the objective that you scored, whether it's a private objective or a public objective. You can have at most 3 secret objectives during the game. When you use an action card's action, you are going to discard the card. Commodities gained are turned to trade goods when given or traded to another player. When you are a neighbor with another player in a system, then you can trade with each other. When researching technology, you utilize the symbols that are in the bottom right corner for prerequisites for technologies, and the prerequisites are in the bottom left corner. So for this technology, you need 2 yellow prerequisites. Some planets or planet cards can be exhausted for prerequisite technologies if you see it on the card. There can be 2 PDS and 1 space dock on each planet. An upgraded PDS can shoot through a wormhole. Rounds will continue on until the first player reaches 10 victory points, and they are considered the winner and claim the Imperial throne by having the most dominant faction, and wins Twilight Imperium 4th edition.